Okay, so I mean, one of the problems that Macbeth faces, right, and this is, I mean, if you want to think in terms of Macbeth as a character and whether or not he has something, I mean, you hesitate to use the kind of, it's a little bit outmoded to talk about a tragic flaw as a concept, but if he has a tragic flaw, um, it's that he puts just enough trust in the prophecies of the weird sisters, right? Not enough trust, and he doesn't put no trust in them, and he doesn't put total trust in them. He puts some kind of weird middle ground amount of trust, and this is actually part of his problem. Um, he could put no trust in them, right? Are these weird sisters really somehow in touch with fate, destiny, providence, um, or are they just is just bunk, right? Which is what both Macbeth and Banquo contemplate the possibility that they're just full of it. Back in Act One, Scene Three, when they say, to win us to our dooms, right? That the spirits of evil will sometimes give us a partial truth, and that's the thing is that these women somehow do have access to a partial truth, um, but it's not clear that that's like say set in stone or fixed in some way. Um, and unfortunately, Macbeth he thinks he can sort of sift out which things are set in stone, which things are not, and that's part of his problem, right? And in fact, this is one of the things that the wicked spirit Hecate, right, who's demonic, a spirit from hell of some sort, um, says to the weird sisters in Act Three, Scene Five. She comes on stage. Part of this is not a scene that Shakespeare wrote. This is a scene. Part of this is an adaptation from that other play, The Witch by Middleton. Um, you okay, Julie?
Yeah, did we all get kicked off or just me?
Somehow I think it was just you. I think it might have just
Oh,
been you.
it took me. I couldn't even get back onto UTEP at all. It just kicked me off everything.
I'm sorry, all
So
you got.
I'm back.
Well, thanks. And this will be recorded, and you can certainly watch the part that you
Yeah,
missed. And
so I can watch what I missed.
yeah, and I'll just say again, how much I appreciate you guys coming to these lectures, which, like, I know that this is a huge obstacle for us, and the university itself was very concerned that maybe the IT our information infrastructure at the university might not be able to accommodate 10,000 students trying to be online and watching a lecture at the same time. So thank you for persisting, all of you. Anyway, so Julie, we're on point number three of the lecture. I just took a quick pause, and we're looking at Macbeth and the question of security and the fact that he puts kind of not enough or too much, somewhere in the middle, which is a kind of wishy-washy, bad middle amount of trust in what the witches have to say. And I was going to turn our attention to Act Three, Scene Five, which is on page 57 of our book. Um, so on the one hand, Hecate she gives she's chiding the witches. What are you doing? Giving Macbeth any kind of encouragement, right? I mean, that if you're a wicked person, aren't you supposed to always be like looking for the destruction of individuals and so on? She says a little bit earlier at the beginning of that scene, "Have I not reason, beldams as you are, saucy and overbold? How dare you trade and traffic with Macbeth in riddles and affairs of death? And I, the mistress of your charms, the close contriver of all harms, was never called to bear my part or show the glory of our art." Like, so what are you guys doing freelancing this idea of trying to turn Macbeth? But she says I mean, basically she's predicting, right, that they're going to have another encounter with Macbeth in Act Four, and to kind of prepare the way, she's going to go and get some kind of distillation from the moon or something like that, right? And she says, around line 20, around line 30. He, Macbeth, shall spurn fate, scorn death, and bear his hopes above wisdom, grace, and fear. And you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy. And this is the thing that kind of is going to undo Macbeth, right? He is going to put just enough trust in what the Weird Sisters have to say to him that it's going to end up getting him in trouble. And so this leads, for instance, to so this leads, for instance, to the conflicting apparitions of Act 4, Scene 1, right? So there are three things come up out of the cauldron in Act 4, Scene 1, right? There's um, an armed head. This is on page 65 if you're following along on our edition around line 91, 92 or so on. An armed head comes out of the cauldron and says, you, this is the least the least equivocal thing that Macbeth is going to hear. Beware the Thane of Fife. That's Macbeth. Macduff. Macduff is your enemy. And then a second apparition, this bloody child comes out of the cauldron and says, "Be bloody." This is line 101. "Be bloody, bold, and resolute. Laugh to scorn the power of man. For none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." Now Macbeth is going to misunderstand that, or he's not going to understand that there's a kind of ambiguity about what's just been said to him. And his response at line 104 is, "Then live Macduff. What need I fear of thee?" Right? So first warning, beware of Macduff. Second warning, beware of anyone born. You don't have to beware of anyone born of woman. Well, those two things seem like they should be in conflict with each other. And Macbeth says, "But I'll yet make assurance double sure and take a bond of fate." Right? So I'm going to try to, control my fate, control my destiny. I'll kill Macduff because the first spirit has told me that, and I already kind of recognize that Macduff is kind of one of my enemies. But even though the second spirit has said you don't have to fear anyone born of woman, just to be safe, I'm going to try to get rid of Macduff. Okay, so and then on to this third thing, that you don't have to fear 114, 115. Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Burnham to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. And oh gosh, that seems impossible, right? So he should feel totally secure, right? And that is the thing that he does. And in fact, that's that third vision is the one that kind of leads him on, right? When he gets to in Act 5, Scene 3. As the play is moving towards its conclusion, right? He's got this kind of self-assurance, arrogance. He's sure that he has nothing to fear. He says at the very beginning of Act 5, Scene 3, this is on page 87, he says, "Bring me no more reports," right? I don't want to hear any more about this army that's coming towards me. "Let them fly, all. Till Burnham wood remove to Dunsinane, I cannot taint with fear." Okay, so, until, the Ents show up and the forest starts moving, I'm not going to have anything to fear. So he's got this kind of determination that, some of what the witches say must be true. Of course, the thing is, or a thing is, right, that he doesn't want fate to be. He doesn't take all of fate. Like, so these witches have laid out all this whole big sort of destiny and fate and so on, and he basically wants to kind of pick and choose about what he can put his trust in, right? We talked a little bit about this before, but I'll just mention it. You don't have to go back to it, but in Act 3, Scene 1, around line 73, in a soliloquy, right, when he's talking about, like, how am I going to hold on to my power, hold on to this throne, and to his mind, Banquo, because of the alternative, the second half of the prophecies that were given to him in Act 1, Scene 3, Banquo seems to represent some kind of an obstacle. And so he feels he has to get rid of Banquo, even though it's not Banquo, it's Banquo's heirs that are the problem for him, right? But he says in Act 3, Scene 1 at line 71, rather than letting Banquo's heirs become kings, come fate into the list and champion me to the utterance, right? So my fate about being king has got to outweigh the fate about Banquo's heirs being king, doesn't it? And so he's trying to fight against fate there. And evidence sort of shows, right, that fate is pushing ahead, and he doesn't have any control over it. Exactly what the witches had said comes to pass, right? Banquo does get murdered, but Fleance escapes, and it turns out that Fleance represents an alternative and a threat to Macbeth's longevity and his heirs and all the rest of that kind of stuff being on the throne. And then the apparitions in Act 4, Scene 1, when the line of Banquo's kings shows up, that should just sort of it should convince Macbeth that fate is working against him, right? But he wants to some of fate should work for him, some of fate won't work for him. So until Dunsinane until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, he says in Act 5, Scene 3, he's got nothing to fear. And then he goes on from there. What's the boy Malcolm? Was he not born of woman? This is Act 5, Scene 3, line 5. And so if Malcolm was born of a woman, I don't have to fear him, according to what the second apparition had to say. The second apparition had to say. The spirits that know all mortal consequences have pronounced me thus: Fear not, Macbeth. No man that's born of woman shall e'er have power upon thee. Then fly, false thanes, and mingle with the English epicures. The mind I sway by, and the heart I bear, shall never sag with doubt, nor shake with fear. Right? So he's got this unfounded confidence in how he has interpreted what the apparitions of the witches have said to him. And in fact, I mean, one thing that you could do, for instance, is look at line 6. His "Fear not, Macbeth. No man that's born of woman shall e'er have power upon thee." That's not exactly what the apparition had said to him back in Act 4, Scene 1. And so, he's interpreting that. He's crushed. I mean, he's like Malvolio, right? He's crushing it for his own kind of self-interested way of thinking about things. It's that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth is different than born of a woman. I mean, it's a slight difference, right? But it is going to be a critical difference when he gets to the end of the way that the tragedy is going to play itself out. Now, so he's got this false sense of security, and this is going to be what's going to lead him. Well, I mean, the question is, does this lead him to his demise? It seems to, right? I mean, again, you may just decide that fate is not actually. I mean, it looks like fate, but maybe it's not actually fate at all in this play, and maybe it's just the fact that there is a bigger army there, and Macbeth has to rely on fearful mercenaries to fight for him instead of loyal Scottish thanes and stuff. Maybe that's why he loses at the end of the battle, at the end of this conflict. Anyway, on to point number 4, Macbeth's mania and anomie and fatalism. So on the one hand, this overconfidence, like you can see, I mean, one of the things that's really peculiar about Macbeth, and again, I mean, I don't do psychoanalytic criticism. I mean, I'm interested in how psychoanalysts, that is, people with a psychoanalytic interest, approach literature and so on. That's not mainly my main thing. But I mean, one of the things you can see about Macbeth in this, particularly in this last part of the play, is him kind of bumping back and forth between highs and lows, this kind of mania and depression about super confidence, like that little bit at the very beginning of Act 5. I'll never fear because I've got these prophecies in my pocket, basically, versus what seems like a kind of fatalism in Act 5, well, all the way through Act 5. There's a kind of fatalism a couple of lines later in Act 5, Scene 3, when he's hearing about this larger and larger and larger English force that's arriving, and he says at line 22, "This push," right, the arrival of additional English forces, "will cheer me ever or deceit me now. I have lived long enough. My way of life has fallen into the sere, the yellow leaf, and that which should accompany old age as honor, love, obedience, troop of friends, I must not look to have, but in their stead curses, not loud, but deep, mouth, honor, breath, which the poor heart would fain deny and dare not." And this is on the one hand, that's a kind of a recognition on Macbeth's part that he has, he is going to he's holding on to the throne, but he's not, he even recognizes that he's not a good king, right? That he has subjects, but that they prefer not to be his subjects if they could. That he doesn't have, he has obedience, but it's mostly out of fear, not out of loyalty or love. And that instead what he has is, when people aren't around, they're complaining about what a terrible leader he is. That when they see him, they speak to they say nice things to his face, this mouth, honor, and breath. But that, inside, most people recognize that Macbeth is a bad king, right? So he wants to hold on to, he seems to want to hold on to the throne, even though he knows he's doing a terrible job of it, and that people despise him. But to an extent, right, this is the peak of his ambition, right, to have become the King of Scotland. And this, by the way, is there's a concept that Lewis mentioned, just kind of in passing, in that essay that I have mentioned, this the polychronicity in Macbeth. but he mentions the concept of anomie, which is a sociological term developed by Emil Durkheim at the end of the 19th century. But it's a kind of um, like Brave New World uncertainty kind of thing, right? Like, so when the social norms have been kind of working in one way and people are conforming to that set of social norms and they understand what like winning and losing within that set of context that context means and so on, when the form in which that society is existing breaks, um, you're left with this kind of, okay, now I don't know what's important. Now I don't know what's winning or losing, what's good or bad, um, what's success or what's failure, how I should act and so on. And that's the concept of anomie, Anomie, and to an extent, you can see the idea of a of a of a of a thane of Macbeth having killed off the monarch and upset the framework for that society. That Macbeth is kind of making it up as he goes along now, right? And to an extent, you can use that same concept, I think, to talk about like one the Henry IV, right? Once they get rid of Richard II, it's hard to kind of like put all the pieces back together and figure out a framework for how to get people to be loyal and obedient and so on. Macbeth is definitely dealing with that in a much more like on the one hand more immediate, but at the same time, this is a different kind of play than Henry IV or Richard II, right? Because it is really focused on Macbeth and not on the different parties in Scotland or anything like that. But in any case, this idea that Macbeth is just sort of trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to be a king when everyone hates the king? That's a sort of an enemy, right? And then this sort of fatalism, it gets even worse as he's going along. And Act 5, Scene 5 has a fair amount of this, right? In the beginning of Act 5, Scene 5, so he's got this big army that's starting to kind of come to him, and he's still trying to hold on to the idea of that he's got some certainty, some security from what the witches have said. And he says it again. You get lots of little soliloquies, right? But another soliloquy of Macbeth here, Act 5, Scene 5, around line 9. I have almost forgot the taste of fears. The time has been my senses would have cooled to hear a night shriek, and my fell of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir as life were in it. I have supped full with horrors, direness familiar to my slaughterous thoughts cannot once start me. And so basically, he seems fearless. He's claiming to be fearless. He's saying, I don't have anything to fear. But it's not a kind of bravery. It's not, I don't think, it's a kind of fearlessness that comes from confidence in who he is or how he is doing. He's kind of got to the end of fear because he's gone through it all. Well, I've done all these terrible things, right? I've committed murders and, all these tyrannous, awful things. What's left is, and I've had conversations with witches and demons and whatever. What's left to scare me? I mean, it's not confidence. It's not bravery. It's a kind of, what's next? What can happen next to me? And so when he hears that his wife has died, and this is a monologue that Lewis begins basically his article with. Act 5, Scene 5, around line 17. It's probably one of the most famous monologues for sure in this play. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So, I mean, the death of his wife, this should affect him, right? It should make him grieve, should, make him sad, melancholy. He should have some kind of reaction to it. And his reaction to it is a kind of, well, whatever, what's the next thing, right? What's the next thing I'm going to have to deal with? She died, so what? I mean, it's the next And so, like for Lewis, but I think just in general, right? The idea here is that he seems to have embraced an idea of, you know, a kind of nihil. I mean, it's not exactly nihilism, but it's something like nihilism, right? The idea that life is meaningless. We do the things that we do; they don't last forever. There's no afterlife. There's no frame of reference. No eternity that's going to look back on us. It's just it is what it is sort of a way of looking at things, right? And that's to me that strikes me as kind of a fatalism, right? Like, what's next, right? What could happen next? Um, and you could look at that as defeatism or a kind of a surrender. But in any case, that's basically how Macbeth is going to proceed towards the end of this play, right? Um, he's going to fight. I mean, he is successful in the battle and killing off some of the kind of heroic figures, and he just kind of boasts about them. See, you must have been born of a woman, and so on. But even when Macduff is going to reveal a key piece of information, he's just going to be like, well, so what? I mean, I'll just keep going because what else am I supposed to do at this point? Uh, well, and so that's the next point, right? Point number 5, talking about equivocation. And since we're right there, let's talk about this moment. So equivocation, as I said at the beginning of our lecture, and as I've said a couple times before, right? Equivocation is a key concept in. I mean, it's a really charged and loaded term right at the time that Shakespeare is writing this tragedy, because it was through a kind of concept of equivocation that the people involved in the gunpowder plot had been able to justify taking the action that they thought they were going to take, and the way that they had responded once they were put under oath and captured and so on. And it's an idea basically that, well, I mean, like to put it in the kind of most simple terms, the Catholic Church, which had been opposed to the Protestants in England and so on, and various places elsewhere, had sent essentially kind of like assassins and missionaries to try to overturn the Protestant settlement and so on, and had said that it would not be a sin for those who were undertaking this work to have a kind of equivocation in how they responded to things. And so if you could say something out loud and say it in an ambiguous enough way that it was true to you but could be taken in a different sense by the person who was questioning you, that even if you were under oath and even if you had sworn on the future of your soul that you were telling the truth, that equivocation was a way for you to kind of get out from under certain kinds of questioning, right? And so, for instance, I mean, like just kind of, I usually sort of put it this way: if someone had asked a Jesuit priest who actually was guilty of murder, did you kill that person? Right? I'm under oath. Put your hand on a Bible. Do you swear to tell the whole truth? And so help you God. You'll go to hell if you'll tell a lie. What do you say? Did you kill that person? If the priest could say, I did not, and then in their mind say, not kill that person, right? That double negative kind of thing. That all you hear is, I did not kill that person, but the priest has said, I did not kill that person. That's a way to kind of get out from underneath that. That's this idea of equivocation. And there's a ton of it in this play, right? And it's introduced. The equivocation is introduced, in the first lines of the play. Foul is fair and fair is foul. The porter knocking at Hell Gate, specifically evokes the equivocator, the person who speaks out of both sides of their mouth and seems to be telling the truth when they're telling a partial truth or a falsehood and so on. And all of these apparitions that the witches have provided to Macbeth, they're equivocal, right? And he knows it, but he just doesn't want to accept it or believe it. And so the idea that of a woman born is somehow means that no human being is capable of defeating Macbeth. So in Act 5, Scene 8, right, he's using that to his advantage, right? When he kills young Seward, the English leader's son, he says at line 11, that's Act 5, Scene 7 at line 11, thou wast born of a woman, but swords I smile at, right? I mean, there's this kind of boastfulness there, right? And then when he finally is confronted by Macduff, who he has been told he needs to be beware of, uh, he says, this is Act 5, Scene 8, as easy may thou the entrenchant air with thy keen sword impress as make me bleed. Let fall thy blade on vulnerable crests. When he's talking to Macduff here, I bear a charmed life which must not yield to one of woman born. Right. So I can't be defeated by anybody mortal. Right. Because everybody has a mother. And Macduff, to spare thy charm, and let the angel whom thou hast served tell thee, Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, right? He is born via cesarean section. Um, and so Macbeth basically, so there's this equivocation here, right? Which is essentially what the apparition has said is anybody who has been through a vaginal birth, you don't have to worry about that. But anybody who's been born by cesarean section, that might actually be somebody you have to worry about. And in this case, Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely whipped, right? He is a cesarean birth. And so Macbeth's response to that, accursed be that tongue that tells me so, for it hath cowed my better part of man, and be these juggling fiends no more believed that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. I'll not fight with thee, right? So you are the guy I actually have to fear. I don't want to fight you. This now I understand the truth of what those weird sisters was saying. I have to get out of here. And then Macduff, then yield thou coward, right? Surrender, and I'll take care of putting you in jail or whatever. Macbeth, I will not yield to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet and to be baited with the ravel's curse, though Burnham would be come to Dunsinane, and thou opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. Before my body I throw my warlike shield, lay on Macduff, and damned be he that first cries, hold enough. And he fights him and dies right there. I mean, it's usually played out for a couple of minutes of fighting and blah, 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 but I mean, he's going to die right here because he's fighting, somebody who was, at least according from the Weird Sisters' perspective, someone who was not born of a woman. Okay. So that sense of equivocation, I mean, Macbeth is realizing this all the way through that final scene that he's been relying on partial truths, but he still has to kind of go through with it, right? He can't not, I mean, once he's embraced it, he's going to keep on pursuing it. So the Burnham Wood, this is kind of anticlimactic now, but looking back at Act 5, Scene 5, when a messenger comes in and says, as I did, Act 5, Scene 5, line 32, as I did stand my watch upon the hill, I looked toward Burnham, and anon me thought the wood began to move. Liar and slave! Let me endure your wrath if it be not so. Within this 3 mile you may see it coming. I say, a moving grove. If thou speakst false, upon the next tree shalt thou hang alive, till famine cling thee. If thy speech be sooth, I care not if thou dost for me as much. I pull in resolution and begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth. Fear not shall Burnham Wood do come to Dunsinane. And now a wood comes towards Dunsinane, right? It's not that the trees are coming; it's that the English army has disguised itself, camouflaged itself under the canopy of Burnham Wood, and is using that canopy as a way of moving forward towards Dunsinane. It's a half truth, right? But it's the truth that sorry, that stupid phone. It's a half truth, but it's enough of a truth, and it gets Macbeth into trouble. Okay, I'm going to stop that part and just take a kind of last minute sort of wrap up, like kind of overview of the play for the last couple minutes of class. So just hold on one second.